Hey, sixth graders, it's Miss Yeager, one of the social studies teachers here at Central Middle School. We're going to start off this chapter a little bit differently this time through a little video introduction. So get yourself ready with some headphones or earbuds and buckle up because this is going to be one of my favorite chapters called The Fur Trade. Taking a look at our timeline, it's important to get a feel for what's happening in this century. We're going to jump into the 1600s. And right about the 1660s, there were two explorers, Radisson and Groseilliers. They came into North America looking for more sources of animal furs. You see, they were hunting in Europe and they were trying to get animal furs that would be used for the European fashion of the 1600s. And most people wanted a top hat or a fur hat, mostly made of beaver. Beaver happened to be the most valuable fur at the time. But they had hunted those animals almost to extinction. So explorers went looking for more sources. And Groseilliers and Radisson found their way into North America. It brought them into the Great Lakes area where they came across many Ojibwa people who were very good hunters at the time. So they began to create routes and maps that could help not only themselves, but other people who were coming to look for furs. It was also during this time in the 1670s that the very first fur trade company was established. It was called Hudson Bay Company, and it was up by the Hudson Bay in Canada. If you take a little close look at the map on the slide, you can kind of see where I'm talking about. And it was there that the very first trade business got started. In the 1680s, Father Louis Hennepin, if you think that sounds familiar, you're right. Father Hennepin came up the Mississippi River. His purpose as a missionary was to try to convert Native Americans to Christianity. He traveled a lot and he wrote maps as well. And he wrote down in his journal about the people that he ran into and who he saw and would report that back in Europe as well. But he spent many years traveling the upper Mississippi River area, interacting with Native Americans. And in the 1680s is when the Dakota and the Ojibwa really worked together to get some of the furs, the animal furs and pelts that the explorers were looking for, the traders were looking for, and they would work together to get the furs they needed, and then the Ojibwa would take it to some of the trading posts so that they could trade for goods that made their life easier. How do you like me now? During this time in the 1600s, the beaver hat was something everybody wanted in Europe. It was the fashion statement of the time, and men and women to wear their felt hats made out of beaver pelts was the thing. The finest and most expensive felt hats were made of beaver fur. Can you think of anything that people want today? What are the fashion statements today? What are the things that most kids like to wear? Well, in Europe in the 1600s, it was the beaver hat. The fur was cut off the skin, it was soaked, and then it was pressed into a beaver felt. So it wasn't furry, but it was definitely pressed down into a felt, into a firm covering. It then was very waterproof as well. It was durable and it stood up well to the wind and the rain that would happen during the time as people walked outside. But the beaver hat was way more useful than a head protector. It was a symbol of social status. Wealthy and powerful people from European ruling classes wore these hats almost everywhere they went. And working class people worked real hard, but most of them could not even afford these things. Now remember, Europeans everywhere wanted one of these hats. They were the fashion statement, and people would save their money and try to get a beaver hat. These are some pictures of what they might have looked like in the fashions of the 1600s. Fashions today are much different. But animals in Europe were being hunted to almost extinction. They needed another source. So European fur traders would pack up super large canoes and they would load it with trade goods, things like knives and kettles and rifles and tools, even beads and fabric that they thought the Native Americans would want to trade for. They would get all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, enter into North America through the St. Lawrence River, and pretty much follow the same path that the Ojibwa took when they migrated to Minnesota. And once they got to these trading posts in southern and mid Canada, down around all of the Great Lakes, trading posts popped up all over the place and it became a real big business. As I mentioned, it became a big business. So if you take a look at this map, you can see the routes that they would take from across the Atlantic Ocean over to North America. They would get beaver furs and bring them back to Europe and sell them. Sometimes they would take those furs all the way down into southern Africa and they would bring them all the way over to India, China. And it was there that they would also trade for other things like fabrics, like spices, fabric dye. And then those dyes and fabrics and spices that they would trade for, they would bring it back all the way around to Europe again and then would be sold. And they'd go get more furs. And this whole buying and selling and trading all throughout the world became a big business. Now, it's important to remember that the lakes around our area, as you know, especially in the cold winter months, are very cold. And that made the beaver fur extra nice. It was so cold that furs would grow thicker. Just like we would put on coats to keep ourselves warmer, the animals that lived around the area, their coats, their furs would grow in thicker in the winter times to keep themselves a little bit warmer as well. Thicker fur meant higher prices, which meant that would be bigger profit for those fur traders. So it was the winter time, and it was these northern lakes and the lakes in Canada that produced really good, thick beaver pelts. And so the Native Americans would know that in that late winter, early spring, when those animals are starting to move again, while they're still a little bit lethargic from possibly hibernating or really being very quiet in the wintertime, they would trap right when the winter started to turn into spring. So the trapping would get beavers when they had their thickest furs, and that would get the best profit. So when you think about one of our learning targets, why was American fur, North American fur, so valuable? And that's because it was thick. And when that thick fur could be pressed into the felt, made durable and waterproof, that would get the fur traders a higher profit in Europe. They would get more trade goods, the things that the Native Americans were seeking to made their life a little easier. And this trade went on for many, many, many years. And it kept going until the fashion changed. And once the fashion changed to more silk hats, the fur trade looking for the beaver fur kind of died off. But while trade was going strong, here is what the traders wanted, and here is what the Native Americans wanted. So if you take a look at both sides of the image in front of you, you can see that the Native Americans were looking for all kinds of things they had never seen before. Their eyes were wide, and these tools and these items that could make their lives a little bit easier or even decorate their clothing was something they wanted. Imagine they could now go hunting with a trap or they could go hunting with a rifle. They could use an axe to chop wood so much easier. Flint and steel might help them create fires so much easier. And kettles, especially when they're cooking over a fire, was much more more durable, excuse me, than just a birch bark basket. And every time a trader would bring some of these trade goods, the Ojibwa and the other Native American groups would come to the trading post to strike up a deal. Thicker the fur, better the trade. Thicker the fur, better the profit. Because the traders were here only to make money. They took those furs back to Europe and would sell them there. So, in this chapter, we're going to be learning about the fur trade. We're going to identify some important vocabulary that we'll need to know and be able to use when we're writing and speaking that shows that we're learning about the targets. We're going to read our text and other print materials using a strategy called read, draw, write. And that will help us take in some of that information and process it getting towards the goal of learning our targets. And three, at the end of this chapter, we're not going to take a Canvas test. We're not going to do a summative like we have the previous chapters. We're going to be creating a one pager. And that is like an illustration that also shows your learning. And once we get closer to that, we'll get you ready for that to be successful. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is a really great chapter, and I hope you're going to love it because we've got a lot of learning activities that gets really interactive. So during this chapter, as I said, we're going to learn about the fur trade, the first time that business really found its way into North America through trading furs for goods that made life easier and finding traps and getting animals that were almost extinct in Europe, all for a hat.